The topic of my talk, more democratic competence education for global democracy. It's a little bit ambitious topic, I must confess. I should say a few things how I got to that title. Actually, I'm started out as an experimental psychologist, seeing, how can we measure moral judgment competence, how can we measure democratic competence, basic competences. And then I developed into an educationist and pedagogue, and I started to develop methods of training this competence in young and old people from 8 years on until 105 years. I've been working with elderly homes, medical schools, and high schools, so the full range. My overall idea is why I'm doing that is I try to foster a competence, I think, which is very basic for democratic way of living, that we're able to engage in a moral discourse, that we're able to solve moral problems, and not only by thinking it through, but also by discussing it with other people. And that is what I try to foster. Now, in the last couple of years, you have seen the news, like I did, about these movements in North Africa and Arab countries, but also in other parts of the world, in the United States, with Occupy movement, that there is a new thrive for more democracy. And that is, for some, surprising that this value, this principle of democracy is still so vivid and empowers people, and that they're engaging for that. And I think that our research in that field, not only my own, but the whole research the last 40, 50 years, started mainly by Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist and educator, and Lawrence Kohlberg from Harvard University, also a psychologist and educator, that this research, the findings we have and the methods we have produced, could help to support that movement, not only support it, but make it sustainable. Now, often these movements are short-lived. It's comparatively easy to get away with a dictator. I mean, it needs sometimes your own life, it costs to get away. People have really to fight it before the tyrant leaves his job. But when he left the job, there is not automatically democracy. The old structures are still there. It's just the person has been displaced. And then the work has to start to build up a democracy. And that is a long process. I know what I'm talking about. My home country, Germany, we got democracy after World War II from United States, Great Britain, and the Allies that got away with the Nazi regime, and then we had to start to learn democracy, and it took us many, many decades, and it's still an ongoing process. We are not a perfect democracy. The idea I start out with is the idea of nations, the idea that was occupied our thinking most time in the outgoing 18th, especially in the 19th century, in the 20th century, that we were creating nations, and we speak today about nation buildings. I think that topic of nations has somehow become anachronistic. Our world is growing together so much that it makes hardly any sense anymore to start to build nations, to put fences around our countries. And nations has become more and more in many countries an excuse for fighting democracy. Dictators are saying other nations are threatening our nation by supporting so-called democratic movements. So I think one of the things we should think about is how we can get rid of the concept of a nation and grow together as a global community. But it is not enough to just tear down borders. Many borders already have been torn down of communication, of traffic, especially financial borders. There's universal global financial business. Partly of commercial borders have been torn partly down. Their thing. But this is certainly not enough to tear down fences. It's also necessary to build up a community and to learn how to live together in a very diverse, culturally, religiously diverse world. And what we especially need, most fundamentally, I think, is to develop the ability to solve conflicts through thinking and discussion rather than through violence and power. These are very similar things. Power is a kind of a violence. It's just a structural violence, we say. It is not that visible violence, like open violence when you kill somebody, but suppressing people, keeping people poor, keeping them away from education, all that is violence against people. And I truly believe that building this core competence, this what we call moral democratic competence, is very essential for building that global community. It's also essential for building a small community, for a partnership, for a neighborhood partnership, for a community, local community, or a nation, but especially important for building a global community. We can build on the fact that democracy is a universal desire. It's a universal value. Many, many studies have shown that almost all people desire to live in a democracy, regardless of culture, of age, of anything. That for some, surprisingly, democracy is really a value that is shared everywhere. And I must say, since I've been traveling more and more in the last years, I've been invited to teach at various countries moral democratic competence workshops I'm giving in Latin America, in places like Colombia, where there is still an ongoing civil war, in Brazil, in Chile, in Eastern Europe, but also recently in China. They invited me to teach democratic competences. The faculty of Marxist ideology of the University of Guangzhou in southern China. I was very surprised about that invitation, and it was a very interesting experience for me too, and for my students, I guess, also. So we do not need to teach moral values. We do not need to impose moral ideology on people. They have it. That's nothing they need. We don't need to waste our time and energy bringing democratic values to other peoples. What they and we ourselves need is the ability to apply our moral ideals of democracy, of justice, of respect to our own behavior. And everybody, you probably as much as I, lack in this ability. We often believe we should do something which is morally good, but we lack the ability to do that. And that is what our focus should be on, and it should not be only on education in general, which is of course very important, but it should also be focusing on a new way of educating, an education that is focusing on fostering these competences and not only on teaching to some math tests or some English tests. That is certainly not enough. It might even be distracting and undermining the democratic cause to use up people's time to prepare for tests rather than learning how to live in a community. My understanding of democracy is heavily influenced by American philosopher and educator and psychologist, the universal scientist John Dewey, who defined democracy not in a way we usually hear it defined, like democracy is going to an election, majority rule and stuff like that. No, he says democracy actually is a way of living together. And we have to learn that way of living together. the structure, the political structures we're having, these are secondary. They are just some specific form of how to organize a democratic way to live together. There can be many other ways. In fact, there are democracies like in Switzerland that have a completely different way of organizing their democracy, different from the United States and from Germany. And one can think of other new forms of democracy, and especially movements like Occupy and others in Germany. They try to think and discuss new ways of organizing our democracy, which with less power relationship, less violence from people to people. John Rawls, an eminent philosopher from Harvard University, also defines democracy in terms of deliberation, of thinking about problems, and of exchanging and debating, and not about installing certain power structures. And one of his kind of successors, colleagues and students, Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner, identifies the core problem of democratic way of living. Namely, we have to talk sometimes about questions which are very difficult to talk about. And you have been in such situations sometimes. I know that we find it very hard because our emotions are so strong. Then either we become angry at the other person, become aggressive, or we better shut down and turn our back on our communication partner and stop talking. That is most often happen. We can talk a lot all day about things we are not really touched on, or we are not concerned about, which do not affect us. But as soon as it gets to a topic where we are affected, where we are really involved and our moral identity is touched, then we find it often very hard to continue our communication or to stay calm and rational. So Jürgen Habermas, another eminent moral philosopher, social philosopher, also empirical researcher, and who has been world-renowned, and also find books from him translated in English. And I just found out that he's one of the most favorite modern philosophers in China. That he, when he came 1 or 2 years ago to China, he had a huge audience that was listening to him. And one of his core ideas, his ethics of communicative action, is that the most basic ethical principles our life should be based on, if we are solving our conflicts with communication, with discourse, and not with power and violence. That is a very simplified summary of his theory of communicative ethics, which is a big book. There's also a small book summarizing the theory of the ethics and relating it to the Kohlberg theory of moral reasoning, that is called Consciousness and Communicative Action. You'll find that in the bookstore. And his theory might be summarized like in that graphic, that he says power and violence is some way, reflects some kind of morality, but a very low, and it reflects some kind of conflict resolution, of ability to solve conflicts, but a very, very low, inadequate way. And what we need to do is to develop and grow and reach a higher level where we don't need power and violence anymore, where we can solve our conflicts through thinking and discourse. I remember when we got our first television set at home, my father would run crazy when in the middle of a soccer game, suddenly the TV set didn't work right anymore, and you couldn't see anything shortly before there was a very interesting session. Then he was not he was an engineer, but not an electronic, so he didn't know which of the many switches to turn and to stabilize the picture again. So what he did do, he hit on the set, and often it worked. So that's what we often do. You know, when we try to solve a conflict, we just don't know which switches we should turn, how we should get through that. We sometimes hit on our partner, and sometimes it seems to be a solution. The other might fall unconscious or dead. Then we have won, but it doesn't really is not really a good solution. If we kill everybody that has a different opinion than we have, then our world would be just one big civil war, and we'll soon have nobody living on Earth anymore. That individual ability or inability corresponds to our social structure. In a society where people can solve their conflicts only through violence and power, they need some higher authority to regulate that, to keep them in control, so they get not out of hand, to give the politicians and the police and the judicial system some power to control our own power. So dictatorships actually fulfill a deep need of people who don't know at all how to solve their own problems. Little children, you know, cannot solve their conflicts with each other. They come to Papa and Mama and say, come on, he's hitting me and I'm right, and help me to win the fight. And then they give you a job as an authority. If we can do that by ourselves, we make all dictators and politicians unemployed. We don't need them anymore. So actually, the social structure in a way corresponds to that structure of individual competence. I want first now to demonstrate a little bit what I've said first, that democracy is a universal desire, and then I will go on and show you at the end also some new method which we developed to foster that competence very effectively in people of different ages and different cultures. Before I say that, I must tell you that's a motto I put about in my dissertation, which was on the measurement of moral competence and on kind of a lot of basic science stuff. And that man, William of Ockham, he was very instrumental for creating modern natural science by telling us some things which are very important. One of the most important things he taught us was, keep your theory simple. Use not more words, not more concepts or entities than that are really necessary. Einstein has written about that extensively and explained what he meant and how much that meant for physicists. And that's something we have not been taught yet in social science. Therefore, I think social science is a little bit standing still, not making much progress, because we love complexity. We believe the world is complex, and therefore our theories must be also very complex. We forget that complexity is in the eyes of the beholder. If we don't understand something, we feel it's complex. When we understand it fully, we think it's simple. So complexity is not a characteristic of the world. It is something that describes our thinking. So William of Ockham, in this Latin saying, "Entia non sunt multiplicanda sine necessitate," don't multiply entities, concepts, constructs without necessity. And that he almost got killed by the Catholic Church, because at his time the monks loved it to discuss complex theories. And every time they lost the debate, they invented a new construct. They called it at that time an angel. So the world was full of angels. So if you lost a debate, then you invented a new angel, and then it helped you to win the debate. Like in modern debate clubs, which are very popular here in the United States and England. You invent something out of the blue to win a debate. But that is nothing that is fun. It's a entertainment, no doubt. But it's certainly nothing to get ahead in science. that is kind of my motto that has led me. So please forgive me if I sound too simplistic. I try to get as far as possible with a simplistic theory. If I'm convinced that it's too simple, of course, then I have to add a new construct and see how it goes. Now, I had this question interactive, but since I had technical problems and it has to be put in a different system, I cannot do it. That's the question I usually ask my audience. Do you yourself desire to be a good person? And usually, and I bet you would say that too, all say, yes, I desire that. And then the second question when I ask, do you always live up to your own moral ideals? Then usually I get 0 hands up. And moral competence is the competence we need to bridge that gap between our grand moral ideals, how we want to live ideally, and what ideal person we want to be, and what we really are able to do. McFall has assembled many studies on that issue, on the value, democracy as a value. There have been many studies all around the world, comparative studies, and they all show and agree that democracy is still a very high moral value everywhere, and that is a safe foundation actually that you can trust. People actually want that, or ideally want it. If they can live by that, that is a different question. And that study was published in 2004, long before the Arab Spring and the developments in Arabia, and also the Occupy movement here, or the student protests in Chile, which are still continuing, as I've seen in war there in February. And I thought this is a very strong value and motivates a lot of people, not only young people. To understand my empirical findings, which I'll show, I want to remind you of Kohlberg's famous 6 stages of moral development. I don't share his theory that people develop exactly in that stage-wide fashion, that they go up stage by stage, never jump over a stage, never regress. I think research has shown that that is not a valid theory anymore. We have very many data now showing that regression is possible. But aside from that, Kohlberg's definition of these 6 stages, the moral orientation that define these 6 stages, they have been very helpful in research. So he says there are 6 levels of moral orientations, from least adequate, so to say, to highly adequate, from stage 1 to stage 6. And even considering physical and psychological forces when making decisions is a kind of moral orientation in a more scientific, broader sense of the term morality. Of course, morality we narrowly often define and keep reserved for the highest stage, 5 and 6. That is what we usually understand as a moral orientation. But the other orientations also show that people have some criterion for behavior, for making decisions. They are not just behaving on random basis. So when you we set up a test, the moral judgment test that Uwe was mentioning, where we presented a dilemma and some arguments for and against the solution of that dilemma that was described there in that story. And we made sure that each argument represented one of these 6 stages of moral reasoning. And then we presented 6 arguments in favor, 6 against. I will show you. And what we found, and then we asked, how do you accept or reject these arguments? And we looked at how people rejected and accepted the arguments, and looked at the stages of moral reasoning these arguments presented. And you see indeed that the arguments representing high stages, according to Kohlberg theory, that these arguments on stage 5 and 6 are preferred much more than the arguments on the lower stages. Stage 1 and 2 arguments especially are almost always rejected, more or less. And that is true not only for German university students. That was an early study in the 1970s and 1980s. We did a longitudinal study actually in Europe when Poland and Yugoslavia still was communist. And we found even in communist countries the same pattern, the same moral orientations were preferred and rejected as in the West European countries. And we have now studies from dozens of countries across the world, and they all agree on that. In China, in Morocco, in Latin America, we find always the same pattern. Even in prisoners who've been in prison for theft or murder, they also have prefer high moral orientations over low one. Nobody we ever found who prefers a low morality as something good. Now, this actually has already been known by Socrates. And that is one of the most frustrating readings I ever did after we did all these studies about moral orientations and high moral, and everybody decided, we found out. And then we found out that 2,500 years before, Socrates knew that already. He said, if nobody is better than the other in desiring good, and he talks more about that in clear. So he said, everybody who desires the good. That was his observations while talking to the people in Athens. He said that there are differences in moral behavior, of course. How can you explain that? And he says, he must be better in the power of attaining the good, what we call moral competence today. Then virtue, in his words, and the term virtue has changed that a lot of times, would appear to be the power of attaining the good. The virtue is actually what we define as moral competence today. And he says, first, he has a two-aspect theory. He distinguishes moral orientations, the desire to be good, from moral competence, the power of attaining it. And this dual aspect theory of moral behavior is the very basis of my own research and my own teaching and educational methods development. So the old model was that moral ideals, moral motivations determine behavior. We know now today that moral motivations do not correlate with behavior. I'm not saying it don't determine moral behavior. They just don't correlate. That's what we often find. But without our moral ideals, we would not behave morally. But in social scientists, they love correlations. And if something does not correlate, it's not important. We throw it away. But why doesn't it correlate, even though it's important? Well, because if a variable does not vary, if there is no differences in the people, then you find no correlation. That's a big mistake we've been taught in statistic courses, that only when you find variation and correlation, then something is important. No, moral ideals are highly important, and we can be happy that everybody shares them. We have no variation. But unfortunately, we show no correlation. But it means also that we do not need to care about that in education too much, because everybody has it, we don't have to teach it. The new aspect of moral behavior which has to be considered is moral competence. That's where the big differences lie, and there where people need help through education. Moral judgment competence has been defined by Lawrence Kohlberg in one of his early writings as the capacity to make decisions and judgments which are moral, that are based on internal principles. So any behavior that is based on internal principles, regardless what they are, is called moral. And that is very important, and often neglected in literature, to act in accordance with that judgment. So you cannot call a person morally competent if he has only some great moral ideals, but cannot act in accordance with that. So part of the definition of moral competence is the ability to act accordingly. So the question often raised in literature, what is the relationship between moral competence and action, is completely nonsense, because it is by definition, it can be called only moral competence if it can be seen and documented in action. So we have to rethink our asking question, that domain again, looking at this definition of Kohlberg. I must confess that Kohlberg forgot about that definition later too. I don't have the feeling he remembered that in some of his later writings. But it caught my attention and it attracted me to that field, and without that definition I would not be standing here. I thought that's a wonderful definition. That is a good definition to build on research and a good definition to build on education. And that's how I got started. Later, when I met Kohlberg and we discussed, I reminded him and said, Larry, what about that definition? You forgot about that. And he answered, come on, let's have a beer together. And that's how a start of a nice friendship. That is a test, moral judgment test, and part of it. We present a difficult moral problem here. It's about mercy killing. Then we confront people with arguments in favor and against it. And we're not interested in the specific answers or the content of the answers. So in a way, we're not interested in reasoning, in the content of reasoning, but in the structure of reasoning. And that structure is seen when you order the answers according to the stages that the arguments belong to, and then suddenly a structure becomes visible, becomes manifest, Kohlberg says, which clearly lets you infer what orientations have determined the person's response behavior. You see on the left side, that person, A, rejects all argument that oppose his opinion on mercy killing and accepts all arguments that support his opinion on mercy killing, but shows hardly any sign that he understood that the arguments differ in regard to their moral quality. On the right side, we have the opposite extreme. That person seems to disregard the opinion, agreement or disagreement nature of the arguments with his opinion, but he obviously carefully looked at the moral quality and differentiates his judgment according to the moral quality of the argument, and he does so consistently. In the pro-arguments and the contra-arguments, he prefers the same level or type of argumentation, or rejects the same type of orientation in both sets of arguments. That lets us infer that person has really let himself guide by the moral quality, by moral concerns when he was filling in the test. In theoretical terms, we call the left pattern a pattern of rationalization. The arguments are used, instrumentalized, to back up an opinion that is not rational, but is come out of the stomach, we say, that is somehow originating, and we defend it, we clinch to that opinion, and we use arguments not for testing our opinion, but just for supporting it. And that's called, in psychoanalysis, for example, rationalization, using our reasons for emotional purposes. On the right side, we have somebody that seems to argue rationally, seems to exhibit some rationality, that person uses reason to test his emotionally originating opinion on mercy killing. We can quantify that through only those now listen who have statistics 1 and 2, through an individual multivariate analysis of variance. That's how we get to the numbers. The number, the scale value, it goes from 0 to 100. 0 meaning that person's response pattern has not been determined by moral thinking at all. 100 means that response pattern has been completely determined by moral thinking, by moral orientation, moral criteria. And that on the right side you see 92 is almost 100. So you get an idea what this number means from 0 to 100. I jump over that. It says pretty much the same what I was just been saying there. Just one thing to mention, that there are occasionally some people who really become very angry at me, that they say, now I have said I'm against mercy killing, why do I have to repeat my opinion 12 more times? And they're not making fun, they just cannot differentiate between an opinion and an argument backing up that opinion. So there seems to be interesting relationships between opinion and argument. On a very basic low level, people feel arguments are just the same as an opinion, they're just repeating the same thing. On a higher level, they feel arguments should serve your opinion. They should just help you strengthening your opinion, not to criticize them. On an even higher level, then arguments are used to test and criticize and critically analyze your opinion and maybe change it. A very nice book on that is Denner Kuhn's book. I forget the title. Denner Kuhn on, I forget the title. I was going to say you, but that goes a lot on that issue. Now you see here, Socrates was right. The ability to make moral judgments, to let moral thinking and orientations determine your judgments, is widely distributed. And you see also it's mostly low. It's in the highest group we have in university students in Germany and Poland. The mean value here is 31.1. And you see even there, competence scores widely vary from 0 to 100. Then in comparison, we have a group of vocational school students with lower training, lower education. Their mean value is 15.6. I don't want to go into the explanation of this difference. I just wanted to show that Socrates' impression, his observations were right, that there is a great variability of that competence. We have also now brain studies of colleagues from the University of Berlin, of Humboldt University, and doing brain scanner studies. We know now that one center, a very strongly involved center in our brain, is on the right side above our right ear, about here, which is especially used for solving moral conflicts. Of course, when you have to solve a conflict, your whole body is involved. As neurologists say, you think with your fingertips and you feel with your cerebellum. That is always the whole nervous system is involved. But we also know there are some centers with specifically high activities when certain works, when you have certain activities or solve certain problems like motoric skills or vision or language. So the moral competence seems to be mostly located on that side. And that side is becoming more active and longer active the lower your moral competence is. When your moral judgment competence is low, you need much more time and energy to solve a problem. So this is lighting up yellow and red, and lots of oxygen is used, and the blood is used and works a lot. And it seems that that area also heats up somewhat. You don't notice it consciously. That's so low the warmth that is growing. But unconsciously, we may notice it, because when you think through a very difficult problem, what many people do is they touch their head. right there where that activity is. It's a speculation, I must confess, but maybe some of you become neurologists and try to test my hypothesis. I'm sorry time doesn't allow me to show the many studies that show that there is a close relationship between moral judgment competence and norm-keeping behavior, helping behavior, even learning behavior, learning skills, school grades, decision-making, that people with high moral judgment competence, as I just showed in the brain study, also show much quicker solving and decision-making. They are able to solve the problem much more quickly. That was a finding that attracted the German armed forces. They gave me a contract to teach officers my methods, because soldiers often have to make very quick decisions, which, when they are wrong, can be deadly or can have a lot of consequences. Drug using behavior is correlated with that very highly. Not only correlated, experimentally, some of the studies have been really laboratory experiments showing that there is a causal relationship with behavior. The one very simple one, easy to demonstrate, is that one where the researchers studied people's moral development with the Kohlberg interview method. Then they pretended they had not much time, and they said, please, would you fill in the rest of the questionnaire? We have here also a questionnaire. You can fill it in by yourself and send it to us back. We give you an envelope with a stamp on it and an address. Not much time you need. Would you do that? And the subjects agreed. So the researchers went home. They had the scores for the moral development scores of the subjects and waited what would happen. And then the questionnaires came back, and what, to big surprise, only those on stage 5 all sent back the questionnaire. On lower stages, more than 60% did not send back the questionnaire. It's not a real big thing, you say, but still it's interesting to see how influential that competence is for our everyday decision making. Cannot go in for time reasons on all the other studies, but there are many, and it's unfortunate that they're not recognized, they're not looked at. Unfortunately, there is no book of that. It's one I still plan to write, where I summarize all these studies. They are spread over many publications. But they show transgressions in test situations where students have to take a test, then the teacher goes out and leaves them alone, and then the students are observed through one-way mirrors, and then you see those who cheat and not cheat, and you see cheating is very high on stage 1, 2, and 3, and it goes down the higher stages are. On stage 5, there's hardly any cheating anymore, without supervision, and nobody is looking after them. Whistleblowing, also, similar development. They all in the same way, and the differences are not just statistically significant, they are psychologically significant. They are huge differences. We did a study in the 70s, 1970s, that's a correlation study. We asked whether, and that relates to the presentation last night, whether it's legitimate to use violence to change society. And those who said agreed had a much lower moral judgment competence than those who rejected that statement. So I think indeed that moral judgment competence is strongly related to terrorism, inversely related, that these terrorists probably lack any sort of moral competence. If they would develop some moral competence, they would not be able to be terrorists. That's what Socrates says. Those people who know really the good cannot but do the good. They're forced to do the good. Nobody voluntarily choose a worse solution. We always choose the best that is available to us. But when only very low violent solutions are available, we choose a violent solution. So that's why I say we should invest in education. We should elevate people's moral competence, because that will undermine violence and power. That will really get rid of that without fighting it. Fighting violence is a contradiction in itself. Using force to eliminate force will never work. We need education. Yeah, that was studies with helping behavior, civil protests, in the early study in 1968 by Norma Hahn clearly shows that there are a positive relationship between moral development and behavior, positive behavior. Milgram experiment was done by Kohlberg, showed clear differences in applying force, violence to test persons, depends strongly on moral development. Moral competence does not come with age. It does not develop by age, as you find often said in many textbooks. It's not a biological thing. It's not just growing if you let people grow biologically. There's no, if you keep other things stable, control it, you find no correlation. You need education. Some basic moral competence probably develops in the early age with the help of parents, but we find basically that our world is so complex that you cannot ever learn to solve all our problems with just what you have been born with, what you have been got with at your birth. You need to learn the development, and that learning development process must be assisted by society, by parents, by educators, by teachers, and it must not just be assisted by any teachers, but the teachers also must know about that, must know how to effectively do that. And for that purpose, we have developed a new method, the Constance method of dilemma discussion, which grew out of a method suggested by Moshe Blatt and Lawrence Kohlberg, dilemma discussion method, but we changed it so much now that you wouldn't recognize the original method anymore. So we now call it, give it a new name, Constance method of dilemma discussion. Its four basic didactic principles is first, the teacher has to provide a learning environment which models the moral orientation, the moral principles that he wants to teach. The learning atmosphere, the learning classroom practice cannot contradict your moral, the aims of your teaching. If you want to teach respect to the students, you cannot treat your students disrespectful. And so we have to kind of realize that in the classroom practice. We also have to help the developing people, all people actually, to construct and reconstruct their moral feelings. Morality is rooted in our feelings first. And you feel your morality only when you get stuck in a dilemma situation. Normally you cannot feel your moral principles. But when you get stuck in a moral dilemma, when several principles contradict each other and you don't know what to do, then you're getting a roast. That's a sure sign that you have moral principles. Without moral principles, you would never feel a dilemma, because then there would nothing contradict each other. And that is the starting point of our teaching. You feel a dilemma, a moral dilemma, but you have no words for it yet. You're just aroused, you're angry, you're furious, but you don't know what is it all about, though you have to put that into words to make it communicatable. So that's what we do. We help students, we confront them with dilemmas, then we help them to give them a language to develop a language. We're not giving them a language, sorry. Kohlberg was saying you give them a language, you should teach them arguments. No, we let them develop the argument themselves. The teacher is completely withdrawn. They start to think and try hard how to think and talk about their moral feelings and communicate them, and they do it together. So they learn, develop a common language, a common understanding, and you have to provide time for that, and especially you have to provide an atmosphere which is free of fear. If they are fearful, if they are afraid of tests after the thing, then they won't be able to develop that capacity. You stop through tests or teacher interference, you stop that learning process. By taking out the teacher and anything that makes students afraid, anxious, you help them to develop that capacity. And it's highly effective. It's not just changing a little bit. It is now, we have changes, increases of moral competence in German schools, which is pretty good school system, 3 points in a year on that scale from 0 to 100. With the moral dilemma discussion method, if it's done by a trained teacher, a certified teacher, he can increase that level of competence within one single session by at least 5 to 6 points. And if he does several sessions and changes his whole teaching style, he can increase that competence by 10 to 17 points. We already had some. And we do regular pre-test, post-test controlling of our efficacy, and we see that we can gain a huge increase within a short time with little work, actually maybe 2 or 3 dilemma discussions a year, and increase what school can does already before. In other countries, Latin America, South Europe, United States, sorry to say, there's hardly any increase of moral competence during college or high school. The system seems to not be able to help students to develop that capacity at all. And I wish I could do a more systematic study and also do some interventions showing that it is possible here too. In Colombia, in Chile, in Mexico, in Brazil, we're working very effectively, partly with medical schools who are worried about that their students usually regress. All over the world, we have studied many countries, model education or more development in medical education, and usually medical students' competence regresses. And now some medical schools have become so worried about that they invited me, help them teach their professors of ethics to reverse that downward movement and change it into upward moving. We're working with prisons where also the moral competence goes down. The longer prisoners stay in prison, the less they will be able to survive in life. And they will soon return, because since they lose their moral competence, they have only violence to survive, to solve their conflicts. That will bring them right back into the prison again. So that's what we try to solve, that vicious circle. By doing that, we did a large-scale intervention in Berlin, in the largest prison of Germany, and we were very effective. We changed the moral development from going down to going up. And I did a self-evaluation of the last 8 years of my teaching at university. I analyzed, I do always, since 20 years, I self-evaluate my own teaching, seeing how effective my teaching is. I test them always before a course and after a course. So I always see whether I'm an effective teacher or not. My lecturing has been completely ineffective as far as developing students' moral competence. It has been very effective, though, I've become more entertaining. I could tell there were only 10% of the age group sitting in my room, and then when I got better and better, suddenly 60% of the age group came to my lectures, which were not enforced. I didn't have any way to force them to attend. So that was a big success, and they stayed almost to the end, the whole semester. And some students said, "Oh, you're more entertaining than any show on the TV, so we rather come to your place for entertainment than looking TV." But they didn't learn much. That's the difference. Entertaining and learning is a difference. In my seminars, which I radically changed according to the 4 principles I was just showing, in addition to doing also dilemma discussions, you see there is a huge increase, a huge progress. Within 3 to 4 months, which a semester takes, we increase it 10 and more points. And if I use a dilemma discussion in lectures, only 1 dilemma discussion, you see, although there was an increase of 3 to 4 points in my lectures. So it's a clear showing that our traditional teaching is not much really of any worse in regard to fostering moral democratic competences. Summarize, I think there is a close relationship, an interdependence between democracy as a way of life, education, high quality education, and moral competence development, that they are very closely interrelated. We see that we need high quality education to foster moral competence, and that is necessary for developing a high quality democratic way of living. On the other way, democratic way of living is also a precondition for successful teaching. We have to change our school system, make it more democratic, respect our students more, less testing especially, letting them more talk, discuss, and think. We don't have an attention deficit problem. We have a thinking deficit problem in our schools. It just goes unnoticed because nobody cares. But when I look at my students, what they lack mostly is the ability to think. They attend to me all the time, and they stop thinking every time I talk. They have learned that. And thinking and attention is mutually exclusive. You cannot think while attending. We also need high morality for learning. We have findings which I could not show. They clearly show that students with higher moral competence are better learners. They remember more facts, but they also develop better capacity to apply what they have learned and use that. I did the test with teachers who said, yes, these new methods of teaching are very important. I love them, but I don't do them because I'm afraid doing them. And when I look at their scores, it shows they have a low moral competence. They are afraid of letting students discuss because then that will cause conflicts, and with conflicts they have not learned to cope with. So they rather stay away from that and go back to what I'm doing here, lecturing. They have everything under control. They don't need moral competence. For lecturing, you don't need moral competence. But for having discussions with students, you need, as a teacher, moral competence. You need to deal with this conflict that inevitably come up. Last word I give to an famous American, Thomas Jefferson. He was debating with Montesquieu, the French philosopher of democracy. The French philosopher of democracy, Montesquieu, was saying, yes, democracy is great, democratic system is great, but people, don't let people participate in that. A little bit funny, yeah, you might say, democracy without people. He said, they can only elect their custodians, their politicians, give their power to the politicians, and then sit back and let them do the rest. Jefferson said, you are in a way right. People are not really fit and educated yet for running a democracy themselves. But rather than taking the power from them away, you should empower them and teach them to learn how to live a democratic way of life. And I certainly am more on his side than on the side of Montesquieu and all those who love to put the power to a few. Thank you very much for listening.